Welcome back to Jay's Central, the place where we do not just report the news. We actually sit down and figure out what it means for this ball club. And today, I have to be completely upfront with you. When I saw this trade come across the wire Friday morning, I had to read it twice. Not because it was shocking in the way that a blockbuster deal is shocking, but because the timing, the context, and the specific names involved create a situation that is genuinely more layered than it looks at first glance. So if you came here expecting a quick 30-second take, buckle up, because we are going deep on this one. The Toronto Blue Jays have shipped outfielder Joey Loperfido back to the Houston Astros in exchange for outfielder Jesus Sanchez. That is the trade in its most basic form. Player goes out, player comes in, both are outfielders, life continues. But if you think that framing captures what is actually happening here, you are leaving out about 90% of the story. And that remaining 90% is exactly what we are here to unpack. So drop a comment right now and tell me, did this trade catch you off guard, or had you been sensing that something was about to shift in that outfield mix? I want to hear from you before we go any further. Let's start with Loperfido, because I think his story deserves to be told with real honesty before we pivot to what comes next. Joey Loperfido arrived in Toronto in the summer of 2024 as part of the return package from Houston when the Blue Jays sent UCI Kikuchi to the Astros. He came over alongside Jake Bloss and Will Wagner in what was one of the bigger mid-season moves Toronto made that year. And look, the expectations attached to Loperfido were significant. He was a young outfielder with tools, with upside, with the kind of athletic profile that scouts get genuinely excited about. The idea was that Toronto was not just getting back players, they were getting back potential. Real, long-term potential. What happened in that first half season was not what anyone envisioned. Loperfido batted .197 over 43 games, with 2 home runs and 52 strikeouts. Now before anyone runs to the comments to either pile on or aggressively defend him, and I know this community well enough to know both camps are about to mobilize, let's be fair about the circumstances. Coming into a new organization mid-season, adjusting to a new environment, a new coaching staff, a new set of expectations, all while the pressure of a pennant race is actively building around you, that is not a simple transition for any 25-year-old. The numbers were rough, yes, but the numbers were also collected under genuinely difficult conditions. What happened next is actually the part of Loperfido's story that I find the most compelling, and I think it gets lost in the broader conversation about this trade. He did not collapse. He did not disappear into Buffalo and fade quietly into organizational irrelevance. He went down, he worked, and he came back a different hitter. By the time 2025 was in full swing and Loperfido was getting regular at-bats between the big league club and Buffalo, he was hitting .333 with 4 home runs and 14 RBIs in 41 games with Toronto. That is not a depth player showing up and going through the motions. That is a young man who took brutal feedback, made real adjustments, and turned himself into a legitimate contributor. In his own words, he left knowing he was a better player than when he arrived. And watching the way he described that growth, with real gratitude, real maturity, it is hard not to root for him to go back to Houston and have a breakout year. But here is the reality of roster construction, and this is the part that gets genuinely uncomfortable to talk about. The Blue Jays' outfield situation was already crowded before this trade, and it would have been even more crowded heading into 2026. Loperfido's path to consistent playing time was not clear. It was not even close to clear. And for a 26-year-old who has now demonstrated he can hit at the big league level when he gets real opportunities, sitting on the bench in Toronto while other outfielders take the at-bats was not a recipe for career development. Going back to Houston, an organization where the outfield picture gives him a more realistic shot at regular playing time, might honestly be the best thing that could have happened for his development trajectory. Sometimes a trade that looks like an organizational subtraction is actually a kindness in disguise. Now, the reason this trade happened when it did, the reason the Blue Jays were willing to move Loperfido and bring in a new outfield piece right at the start of spring training, comes down to a piece of news that dropped this week and fundamentally changed the math on Toronto's roster. Anthony Santander, who signed that massive 5-year deal to come to Toronto and immediately became one of the cornerstones of the off-season rebuild, underwent surgery on his left shoulder on Wednesday. The expected timeline is 5 to 6 months. You do the math. We are talking about a guy who could potentially miss the entire first half of the 2026 season, and depending on how the recovery goes, possibly more. That is not a minor inconvenience. That is a franchise-level problem that demands an immediate organizational response. And that response came fast. Ross Atkins and the front office moved within days to address the void. That urgency, that willingness to act quickly when a critical piece of your roster goes down, that is actually a good sign about how this front office operates. They did not sit back and hope the situation resolved itself. They went out and found a solution. Whether that solution is the right one, whether Jesus Sanchez is the answer Toronto needed, that is the debate we are about to have in the next block. So do not you dare touch that remote. And while you are still sitting there, hit the like button right now. It is the single easiest way to tell me that this breakdown is hitting the mark and that you want more content like this from Jays Central. One click. Let's go. All right, let's talk about the player coming the other direction, because I think Jesus Sanchez is someone that a lot of Blue Jays fans are not deeply familiar with yet. And given the role he is about to play on this roster, that needs to change immediately. So let me give you the real picture of who this guy is, what he brings to a lineup, and why the front office was apparently enthusiastic enough about his fit that they pulled the trigger on this deal within days of Santander's surgery being confirmed. Jesus Sanchez is 28 years old. He is a left-handed hitter, which immediately matters in a very specific way that we are going to get into. He spent last season split between Miami and Houston, which already tells you something. He was traded mid-year, which means he was in a situation similar to what outfielders on transitional rosters often face. His final line across 134 games was a .237 batting average, 14 home runs, and 48 RBIs. Now I know what some of you are already thinking in the comments, and go ahead and say it. I am genuinely curious what the reaction is going to be, because those numbers on their surface look like solid but not spectacular production from a guy who started 134 games. Average around the Mendoza line plus some power is not exactly the description of someone who fills a franchise-level hole. But here is where the surface numbers mislead you if you stop reading after the slash line. Ross Atkins said something in his comments about this acquisition that caught my attention immediately, and it is the kind of quote that reveals how the front office is actually thinking about this player. He said, and I am paraphrasing here, that Sanchez hits the ball as hard as anybody. Hard contact, exit velocity, the ability to absolutely punish a baseball when the connection is made. In the modern analytical framework, that profile, a guy who hits the ball extremely hard even when his batting average is mediocre, is actually a profile with real upside, because hard contact rates are one of the stickier predictors of offensive performance. A guy who hits .237 but consistently puts the ball in play at elite exit velocities is a guy who is one or two mechanical adjustments away from a .270 season with 25 home runs. The underlying quality of contact is real. The results have lagged. New environment, new coaching, new approach. The ceiling on a player like that can move quickly. Let me also give you the career picture because it contextualizes the 2025 line in an important way. Over 6 major league seasons and 580 games, Sanchez has hit 73 home runs. That is meaningful power production from a corner outfielder. That is not a guy who stumbled into the big leagues and survived on defensive value. That is a player with a demonstrated track record of being able to hit for power at the highest level of professional baseball. The question was never whether the power was real. Everyone who has watched him knows the power is real. The question has always been about the consistency of the contact and the batting average floor. And that is a solvable problem. That is the kind of problem that good hitting coaches and the right organizational structure can actually address. Now here is the piece of this that I think is being massively underappreciated in the initial reaction to the trade, and it gets back to something Atkins was very specific about in his comments. He mentioned that Sanchez represents a particularly good option against right-handed pitching. Let that sit for a second. Because when you look at Toronto's lineup right now, at the mix of hitters they are running out there on a daily basis, the ability to deploy a legitimate left-handed power bat against right-handed starters is enormously valuable. Platoon advantages matter. They compound across 162 games. Every time a manager can put his lineup at a structural advantage against the opposing starter, that is manufacturing winning percentage in a way that does not show up in any individual player's stat line, but absolutely shows up in the standings at the end of September. And when you combine that with the news about Santander, a switch hitter who obviously had both sides of the plate covered, the specific need for a left-handed bat with power against right-handed pitching becomes even more acute. Santander's absence does not just remove a power bat. It removes an offensive profile that had a very particular strategic value in how the lineup was being constructed. Sanchez does not replace everything Santander brought. No single player does. But the left-handed power against righties? That overlaps directly. That was a conscious, deliberate piece of the acquisition logic, and Atkins said as much. Now let's get into the full picture, because I believe in giving you both sides on this channel. I am not here to sell you on every move the front office makes without scrutiny. The legitimate question about Sanchez is the defensive side, and whether his glove complements or complicates what Toronto is already doing in the outfield. Atkins was complimentary in his comments, described him as a two-way player, credited his base running, called him an above-average runner. And look, if those assessments are accurate, then Sanchez is not just a designated hitter type who you trot out there and hope nothing gets hit his direction. He is an actual outfielder who can hold his own defensively. But we have seen front offices be optimistic about defensive metrics before, and sometimes that optimism does not survive contact with the reality of a full season. That is worth monitoring as spring training unfolds. What I can say with real confidence is this. The front office made a fast, logical response to a genuine roster emergency. Santander goes down for months, and within days they have identified a left-handed power bat with a profile that fits the specific gap created by that absence. That is the kind of organizational responsiveness that contending teams need. You cannot afford to let a roster hole sit open and hope it closes on its own. The Blue Jays closed it. Whether Sanchez is the perfect solution or just the best available solution in a tight window, that is a different question. But the direction of the move was right. Let's talk about what it means for the bigger picture heading into 2026. And before we get there, seriously, if you are locked in on this breakdown, if this is the level of analysis you want from a Blue Jays channel, smash the like button and leave me a comment telling me what your honest first impression of Jesus Sanchez is. I want the unfiltered takes. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Okay, we are in the final stretch, and this is where I want to pull all the threads together and give you the honest, complete assessment of what the Toronto Blue Jays roster looks like right now. Not through rose-colored glasses, not through catastrophic pessimism, but through the clear eyes of someone who has been watching this organization closely and genuinely wants to understand what they are building. Let's start with the uncomfortable truth, because I think glossing over it would be doing you a disservice. The Santander injury is significant, not just in terms of what he brings offensively, and his track record speaks for itself. 44 home runs with Baltimore in 2024, a player who was brought in on a major financial commitment specifically because the organization believed he could anchor their lineup, but in terms of what his absence does to the depth picture across a full season. 5 to 6 months is not a hamstring tweak that costs someone 2 weeks. It is a timeline that, at its most optimistic, has him back in the final stretch of the regular season. At its least optimistic, he could realistically miss the entire meaningful portion of the year. Toronto went all in on Santander as a lineup cornerstone, and right now that cornerstone is sitting in recovery. That is a real problem, and pretending otherwise is not analysis, it is just fan comfort food. But here is what I want you to hold alongside that uncomfortable truth. The Blue Jays have been here before. Not in the exact same way. Obviously, every injury situation is different, but in the broader sense of having something go wrong before a season even begins and needing to find a path forward through the chaos. What defines a good organization in those moments is not whether bad things happen to them. Bad things happen to every team. It is how quickly and how intelligently they respond. And the response to Santander's surgery has been, by any objective measure, fast and logical. The Sanchez acquisition happened within days. The roster is not sitting idle while the medical situation plays out. Now let's talk about the outfield picture as it currently exists, because I think it is actually more interesting than the initial reaction suggests. You have Sanchez now occupying a significant role against right-handed pitching. You have George Springer, whose health and production will be absolutely central to how this team performs. You have players like the remaining outfield depth pieces who are now fighting for a clearer opportunity with Loperfido gone and Santander on the shelf. The competition for playing time, which was one of the factors that made Loperfido's situation in Toronto so difficult, actually becomes genuinely meaningful now. There are real opportunities in this outfield, real at-bats on the line. Players who step into that void and perform could define their careers with what they do in the first half of 2026. And this is where I want to say something that I think gets overlooked in the trade deadline and off-season coverage cycle. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to a young player, a guy who has been stuck behind established veterans on a deep roster, is for an unexpected roster disruption to create the opening he has been waiting for. Somebody on this Blue Jays roster is going to step into expanded playing time because of Santander's injury and because of how the outfield is now structured. And if that player is ready, if he has been doing the work, staying sharp, staying mentally engaged even while riding the bench, then that forced opportunity could be the moment his career turns. History is full of those stories. Players who became cornerstones of franchises because an injury to a teammate created an opening at exactly the right time. Now let me address the broader question that I know is living in the back of every Jays fan's mind right now. Is this team still a legitimate contender for 2026? Because that is ultimately the question that every roster move, every injury update, every trade needs to be evaluated against. And my answer is yes, but with real conditions attached. The rotation still has pieces that can compete in the American League East. The bullpen, as we have discussed extensively on this channel, is a genuine strength even with the potential upgrades still being explored. The core of this lineup, even with Santander absent, still has Vladimir Guerrero Jr. at its center, and there is no downgrading what he means to this offense. A healthy season from Springer. The left-handed power that Sanchez can bring on a consistent basis. The lineup is not ideal right now. It is not what the front office drew up on the whiteboard when they were planning this offseason. But it is not broken either. It is a team that is absorbing a significant blow and finding ways to stay functional and stay dangerous while it waits for its full complement of players to become available. The real test is going to come in the first 2 months of the season. If Toronto can play competitive baseball in April and May with Santander unavailable, if they can stay within striking distance in the division standings while running a lineup that is operating with an obvious gap, then when Santander comes back and the roster reaches something closer to full strength, the ceiling on what this team can do in the second half and in October becomes genuinely exciting again. That is the scenario the front office is clearly building toward. They are not panicking. They are bridging. And Jesus Sanchez is a bridge piece. That is not an insult. Bridge pieces are critically important in roster construction. A good bridge piece keeps a team from falling apart while they wait for a permanent solution to emerge. If Sanchez can give you 30% of what Santander would have given you, if he can keep the left-handed power presence in the lineup from becoming a complete void, if he can defend his position and not cost you games on that side of the ball, then this trade was the right call. Simple as that. Before I wrap this up, I want to come back to Loperfido one more time, because I think the human element of this story matters as much as the analytical element. He walked out of Dunedin having gone through real adversity in Toronto, having made real adjustments, having been part of a postseason run that he described as something he will carry for the rest of his life. That is not a player who failed. That is a player who grew up under difficult circumstances and came out better for it. The Blue Jays were part of that growth story. And now he goes back to Houston with more experience, more resilience, and more self-knowledge than he arrived with. I want to see him succeed there, and I genuinely think he will. So here is where we land. The Blue Jays made a fast, defensible move to address a genuine roster emergency. They identified a player with real power production and a specific skill set that fills the most urgent gap Santander's injury created. The trade has legitimate upsides and legitimate risks, as every trade does. The 2026 season is going to demand patience and adaptability from this fan base in ways that were not part of the original plan. But the organization is responding. They are not standing still. We are going to keep watching this situation extremely closely here at Jays Central as spring training gets underway and the full picture of what this roster looks like in game conditions starts to emerge. Every development, every lineup update, every piece of news that shifts the competitive picture, you are going to hear about it here first. So here is what I need from you right now before you leave. First, and I mean this genuinely, leave a comment below with your honest assessment of this trade. Do you think Sanchez fills the void? Do you think Toronto gave up too much in Loperfido? Do you think this is enough? Or does the front office need to keep working? Real answers only. This community is sharp and I read everything you send. Second, if this video gave you real value, if this is the level of Blue Jays coverage that you want in your life, hit that like button right now. It is the single most direct way to support what we are building here at Jays Central, and it helps us reach every other Jays fan out there who deserves this kind of analysis. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this community. We will see you in the next one.